Hi everyone, I just wanted to take a couple of minutes to go ahead and do the response over Chapter 13. Now, Chapter 13 outlines some incredibly interesting things when it comes to the concept of the internet. Most importantly, though, it analyzes how there is a widespread difference between what people have access to and who those people are that have access to the internet first and foremost. Now, what we'll see specifically through this analysis is that there are a lot of people that are lacking access to the internet, specifically the older generations, and then abroad we see an even more despair situation. But we can start with talking about older generations. Now, we are probably some of the best parties to recognize and understand that people like our grandparents don't necessarily understand the way the internet works as well as we do. And what we have to recognize from this is that it actually makes it incredibly difficult for them to do things like have access to jobs. Now, the analysis shows us that unemployment rates for those that are over 60 have doubled between 2007 and 2009, while the overall unemployment rate had reached a 26-year high. Older workers who lacked the skills were suffering disproportionately. Now, what this means specifically is that those that have less of an immersion when it comes to technology have been disproportionately impacted when it comes to their ability to be given jobs and be given an opportunity to find employment. This has two major impacts. First and foremost, it means that these people aren't actually having the opportunity to get jobs. This not only impacts the way our economy functions because there's less money going in and out of it, but it also negatively and disproportionately impacts this group of people. But even further than that, the second impact is that it has two entitlements. Now, when people are over 60 aren't working, it makes them more apt to draw from Social Security as soon as possible. And this means that the money going back into Social Security isn't coming out isn't going in as quickly as it would be coming out because they're put in positions to where they're not paying back the Social Security if they were pulling and still working to put money into the system. Now, these two impacts by themselves don't sound very major, but then when we look at the long-term implications, what we specifically see is that if we're continuing to pull money out of entitlements without the money going back in, it negatively impacts the future generations, such as millennials. But even further than that, when we don't have a regulated amount of money going in and being circulated within the economy, it negatively impacts them as well. Which is why we can then look at the second major disproportionate impact that the internet has on society today. The world and how the internet access is disproportionate across the globe. Now, living in the United States, we don't think of this as a problem very often, only because we do have regular access to internet. Maybe some pockets of the United States have less access and only have access through things like public libraries or schools, but a lot of the nation at this point in time has access to the internet. That's what the textbook begins to call the top billion. Now, the CIA estimates that only 1.6 billion people out of the world are actually connected to the internet right now. This has a couple of impacts. Since we live in such a digital society nowadays, it shows us that the implications to people getting less information because of their lack of internet is growing wider, and therefore the impact is deeper. This impact is that people aren't able to appropriately interact with the global society and the global culture because they aren't as aware of what's going on. Take the death of Stan Lee, for example. This is something that has shaken the entire world because of its understanding of their impact that he had to the film industry. But what we have to recognize is that if people don't have access to the internet, this news and knowledge happens a lot slower, meaning that the next cameo that he appears in the Avengers would not to them resonate as something that is important because he would still be alive in their mind. But even further than that, it actually impacts education. Education is significantly impacted when people don't have access to the internet across the globe because their access to information is significantly lower. For example, when we're talking about global news, and issues such as shootings and bombings, the only way for us to know how these things are happening is with our access to the internet, because we have real-time news updates. It's leaving people in a blank space, and it's leaving people in the dark when it comes to their opportunity to know what's happening within our world. Now, this in and of itself has an impact because they aren't able to relate better to the rest of the world because they don't exactly understand what's happening. But even further than that, we can look at nations that have zero internet access. These nations are disproportionately impacted even further because they're losing an economic sector that they could be significantly benefited from by being able to use the internet. So overall, when we take a step back and we look at the concept of the internet, it's very clear for us to see that the internet does have a lot of advantages. It gives us access to information and allows for us to have good education. But it also has drawbacks to people that haven't been appropriately exposed to it, such as the older generations and locations that don't have widespread access to internet. Thank you.